Dr. Gardner with the University of Illinois Extension will present Seed Starting, Giving Your Garden a Head Start. It will also be hosted by the Carroll Stream Library on Zoom. And then I also wanted to mention that we're collecting membership dues for 2022. Membership is only $15 per year for family. It's never required to be a member to come to any of our programs, but membership does help to pay for some of our costs. And if you would like to join, I'll put some information in the chat later on this. And then also, please make sure to put any questions that you have into the chat, because at the end, we'll have a question and answer session. And then just put in the chat and we'll save the questions to the end. And then now I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Connie Kollmeyer, who is an environmental educator for the Conservation Foundation and has been gardening organically for over 25 years. In addition to teaching and gardening at the Conservation Foundation, Connie also teaches sustainable vegetable and herb production classes and composting classes in the Sustainable Urban Agriculture Department at COD, and she teaches permaculture gardening classes at the Resiliency Institute. She also owns and manages her own small-scale suburban backyard farm and sells organic fruits, vegetables, flowers, herbs, forage goods, and homemade products at local farmers markets. She does garden design, coaching and consulting, and maintenance, and she also volunteers at several gardens in the community. Her presentation tonight will be Growing Mushrooms at Home. And so now I'll hand this over to Connie.
Thank you. Unmute myself here so that you can hear me. So yes, thank you. I'm going to be talking about mushrooms at home, and so this includes both mushrooms that we might find popping up in our backyard and kind of the ecosystem services they provide and the good that they can do and what their value is when we find them in our yards and in our gardens, and then also how we can just an introduction to different types of ways that you may want to grow your own. If you decide that you'd like to grow, I'll give you some direction for that. And so this is kind of an overview. So I may, be brushing with a broad stroke in some areas, but I'm going to try to give as much information as I can in the time we have. So that's, yeah, definitely make sure that if you have questions, let me know and we'll have time at the end so that I can try to answer as many of those as I can. Because it's a fascinating topic and we could talk, we could pick one little bit of it and expand the information a lot. So I'm going to be doing, kind of an overview. So some of it might be general where you might already be familiar with some of these things, but hopefully you'll learn something new and hopefully it'll be interesting and fun. And then maybe you guys will be able to grow your own mushrooms after this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that you guys can see these. Okay, there we go. So mushrooms at home. These pictures here, this right away, right off the bat, these are some of the things that, some of the reasons that I'm interested in mushrooms, because I just find them fascinating. We go for a walk and, like this picture on the left here, this log is just covered. There are so many mushrooms there, and it's really cool to just see how they grow in nature. And if we watch how they grow in nature, we can get some clues that really help us when we're trying to grow our own. And then, so we've got, this is a one shape and size and kind, and then these here, it's a little hard to tell, but these in the center are really, really tiny. These are very small mushrooms. They were on kind of a small stick over the creek, and they're just so tiny and delicate looking. And this part right here at the bottom, this fuzzy looking part, we're going to talk about that in a minute. So I just want to point that out though, so you notice that when we get to it. And then these on the right, the colors, it's like walking into a garden with bright flowers or fruits and vegetables. Mushrooms also come in all kinds of cool colors and can be really bright and colorful. And so the shapes, the sizes, the different places and ways that they grow, and the way they also just seem to pop up out of nowhere when we're in those certain seasons. So our spring and our fall is when they're usually popping up. when the weather is just right for them to grow and fruit. And we'll talk about why I call it fruiting. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they're just really interesting. So I am kind of an amateur. Every time I see one, I want to get a picture. I want to figure out what it is. I want to learn the ID and learn all about it. Plus some are edible, which is always a bonus to me. If we can, if I can find some things that not only are they cool to look at, but some of them can be eaten, then that's always fun too. So working for the Conservation Foundation, I'm sure you are familiar, but our goal is to improve the health of our communities. We're preserving natural areas and open spaces, protecting our rivers and watersheds, and promoting stewardship of our environment. And mushrooms are such a huge part of the ecology and our healthy soils and healthy ecosystems. That's another reason that they're just so interesting. Kind of like Jan was mentioning, some of the things that are happening under the surface, beneath the surface of the soil that we don't necessarily see when we're going for a walk. We just see the mushrooms that are popping up above, or that are on a log or a tree stump or on the ground, but there's so much more happening underneath the soil, and it's really interesting. So most of us have seen mushrooms just right outside our doors, in our yards, in our outdoor spaces. And we'll see all different kinds that will pop up. So this one on the left, these are really interesting. It's important to note when we see our wild mushrooms, what are they growing on? And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes and why that's important. But we'll notice, like here, these are growing on soil and wood chips. There's even one, look at this, under the soil. If you guys can see this, it's kind of popping up from a depression in the soil there, coming up out of the ground. This one on the right, we've got turkey tails, and this is growing on wood. And so the substrate is important to note when we're trying to learn how to ID what we're seeing. But most of us have seen some type. We have stinkhorns. Those are always eye-catching because they're so interesting looking. And if you guys have ever seen or heard of a fairy ring, this is usually when we get a lot of questions where people are wanting to know, what is this? It just popped up in my yard out of nowhere. Usually in the springtime, in the summer, even when there's a good rain coming, you'll see green, like in the grass, in the lawn, you'll see a ring that might be darker green than the rest of the lawn. And then almost immediately after, like a day or two after, all of a sudden you'll have a big flush of mushrooms popping up on that ring in a circle. And so that's attention getting. So that, a lot of times that's when people notice, especially in the suburbs where there are areas with a lot of lawn. Sometimes, because mushrooms like to grow usually in more of a woody perennial type of a system, depending on the type, but a lot of times we associate mushrooms with growing in the woods. But even in the suburbs with the green grass lawn, that's the type then that a lot of people will notice are the fairy rings, a big circle of white mushrooms in the lawn. And a lot of times people wonder then, is there something wrong? Or is this some kind of a problem or some infestation, or do I need to do something about this? Like, why is this growing? And it's interesting that they grow in a circle. And the reason they do that is when the spores land in a certain area and populate that area, they spread outward from the center. And when they reach the ends, when it's time to fruit, those mushrooms will pop up out all of the outer edges of that. And then what happens is the center part will die off first, and it will keep expanding. So sometimes those circles, the next time they fruit, will be larger and then and so on. So it's very eye-catching. So they're really interesting. But we've definitely all seen them. Some are edible, some are not. We definitely don't want to eat them. And some are medicinal, like this turkey tail here on the right, and then others that people might be familiar with, like reishi. And some of those are really, really good to grow at home if you do decide to grow your own mushrooms. Lion's mane is another one. It's supposed to be very good with helping with memory. And that's another one that you can grow at home too. So whether they're edible, toxic, medicinal, there are all kinds out there. Look at these turkey tails. They're just beautiful. They're really, really pretty. And that actually, I'm going to point that out too before I go on. These a lot of times we might not think of that as being something we would consume because it's hard. It's hard like the wood it's growing on, or like hard as a rock. Like it does not seem like something we would eat, but they can be powdered. They can be ground into a powder. And, there are different ways. There are a lot of supplements that are made using these, and teas and coffee substitutes and things like that made with different types of mushrooms. So all kinds of interesting things. So it's really, really cool, whether you're finding them in your yard or growing them there yourself on purpose in your yard or in your house. They're fascinating. So a lot of times, like I said, people, when they see them pop up in the yard, they're not always sure if that's a good thing. And I can kind of understand that because, if you're not familiar, if you're not sure, when we have mushrooms coming up like this on the right, where, they look at this slimy and they smell, this is a stink horn, and they go through these really weird, their growth and the phases, they're just, it's kind of something we don't see all the time. And if it does happen to pop up, people think, oh my gosh, what is this, gross, smelly, weird looking thing. And then these over here that are kind of peeking, I don't know if you guys can see this very well, but these small little finger-like protrusions coming up off of this log, those are actually called dead man's fingers. So these do not sound like things that we would want to have around. It doesn't sound like a good thing. And then aside from that, we have the association with mold. So I pointed out on that picture a minute ago with the tiny little mushrooms and that fuzzy looking bit at the bottom at the base of the stem. And if we look closely, there's some of that here on this one on the left, and this one on the right is zoomed in, so you can see that a lot better. This is the mycelium, but a lot of times we just see that white fuzziness and people think it's mold. And we have negative associations with mold. We think of, moldy bread and then you don't want to eat it, or black mold in a house and it can make people sick. Or some people have allergies and things like that. As gardeners, if we're starting things from seed, we don't want those cool, damp conditions that cause mold and can cause damping off of our seedlings. So there are a lot of reasons that people might think when they see these things pop up that this is bad or harmful. But they're really not. They're good to have. They're part of the ecosystem. They do very important work in the ecosystem. And so we actually do want them, but, again, it's understandable. People think mildew, as gardeners too, if we are ever dealing with fungal diseases in our plants, or like blights or things, different fungal diseases that might be affecting our tomato plants. If we have downy mildew or powdery mildew issues, last year was bad for downy mildew, then that's a lot of times what people think of when they see these mushrooms popping up. So the first thing I want to just really talk about is that it's not the same thing. And these are actually, it's a really good thing when we see mushrooms that are popping up in our soil, even in our houseplants. Sometimes they'll pop up in our yards, our gardens, whether it's on wood, soil. It's usually a sign of a healthy soil web, soil food web, and a healthy soil ecosystem. They're there for a reason, and they're doing a job, and they are actually really beneficial. So it's not something to worry about. And so being a sign of healthy soil, again, if we think about what their job is, their job in the ecosystem, are decomposers. So they are helping to break down plant matter and organic matter of all kinds into smaller pieces in our compost piles. If we have compost, they are a part of our compost crew. I always call them part of our compost crew. They're the workers. So we're putting in the inputs, the food, basically, our food scraps, our leaves and our grass clippings, our lawn, our yard. I don't like to call it waste because I don't like to waste it, but our yard waste. And so we're putting that into the compost system, and we watch this process as it breaks down and turns into this beautiful humus that we're adding. And we want to increase that organic matter in our soil, especially in our area. If we have heavy, wet clay, adding organic matter can really help to improve the soil and help improve our plants' health. And so the fungi is actually, they're the ones who are doing all the work to make that happen. So we really want them. It's again, like I said, we're putting in the inputs into that compost pile, but we're not actually doing the work of turning it into compost. We're kind of managing the system, but really our job is to take care of the soil life. So the bacteria, then, there are nematodes, we've got all of our little soil critters, we have worms in there, and we've got fungi. And so it's breaking down those things into smaller pieces. And by breaking them down, they're making nutrients available to the plants. So they're really, really an important part of this whole overall system. They're not plants, so they don't make their own food. They don't have chlorophyll. They need something to eat. So all of those materials, whether it's on the ground or in a compost pile, it's their job. That's what they eat. They're going to eat that and break that down. And that's doing us a service and helping make our plants healthier. And so, like I said, I mentioned perennial systems. They're a lot of those woody perennials. This is definitely a crucial part of that relationship. And if you think about walking through the woods and that nice forest floor, think about what that's made up of. And it's all of this organic matter that's just been broken down. And so we need that fungal life to do that job. It's really important and beneficial for us. So I never worry when I see, little mushrooms pop up, if it's in a potted plant or in my garden or in my yard. I'm always thinking, this is great. That's a good sign. That means that what I'm seeing up above the soil or above the ground is a good indicator of what's going on below. So I like to see it, and I welcome them in my yard. And so this slide right here also is kind of what Jan was talking about. So we've got beyond just the fact that the fungal life is helping to break down the organic matter and make nutrients available, it goes even further beyond that. And so different types of fungi will have a mutually beneficial relationship with the plants around it. So in this case, and I think this image, which came from New Zealand Geographic, I borrowed it from them because I really liked their image, so I'm using theirs. They illustrated this very well, I think. So you can see the gray parts on here are the roots of the plants. So in this case, we're talking about a couple of trees. If we think about how far these roots reach into the soil, they're reaching for water, minerals, they can only go so far though. They only reach so far. These different types of fungi that can have this mutually beneficial relationship, they rely on each other. Again, they don't have chlorophyll. A mushroom that you see up here above the soil level does not have chlorophyll. It's not making its own food. But the plants that do, as they're going through this process, and they are creating sugars and carbs, and the fungal life in the soil needs some of that. So they will actually reach out. You see the green here in the center that looks like roots. That's actually the mycelial network. It's the mycorrhizal. These are mycorrhizal fungi. And sometimes you'll see that, like if you purchase soil, a bag of soil, it'll say mycorrhizal. This is what they're talking about, that it's got this in there that is helpful to your plants because it's going to reach out. It has hyphae, they connect, they go long, and they will reach out and they actually wrap around the roots of a plant. Think of it like a little hug. They're going to wrap around the roots of the plant, and they actually are going to be taking some of those, the sugars and carbs from the plants, from their process of photosynthesis, and they are able to use some of that for themselves. But then in return, in exchange, because they can reach so much farther in the soil and they have a much larger network, they can reach so much farther, they can actually get water and nutrients and minerals from places where the tree or the plant can't reach, and they can bring it back and they can exchange it with the plant. So they are exchanging nutrients and water and vitamins and minerals and the sugars and carbs and the things that they need. It's kind of like us breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide, and the plants breathing in the carbon dioxide and breathing out the oxygen. It's the same, mutually beneficial type of a relationship. And so this is important because not only are they breaking down the organic matter in the immediate area around the roots to make nutrients available, but they're actually reaching way farther to be able to grab what else might be needed if there isn't enough right there. And there are different numbers, different studies, different statistics, but just a rounded estimate is that this type of relationship actually effectually makes the reach of that plant 700 times greater than what they would have just on their own. So this is really, really important, and it's fascinating. So definitely an important part of the ecosystem. Now, when we're getting into our yards and our gardens and, you know, we find all these really cool things, we do know that some are edible, some are not. So we definitely always want to be absolutely 100% sure of what something is. Get it verified. If you have any doubt, even if you don't have any doubt, until you know well enough that, like, you know, it's not worth chancing it, because there are definitely mushrooms that you would never want to consume, and there are different levels of toxicity. There can be some where you might eat it and get a stomach ache or make yourself really sick. There's some that might put you in the hospital, and there are some that are absolutely deadly. So we don't want to take chances. There are so many types and varieties, and there are a lot of lookalikes. So sometimes it can be a little difficult, you know, to really make sure 100% that your ID is correct. So if ever you have any doubt, and like I said, even if you think you don't have any doubt, you know, it's just better to verify it. It's better to be safe than sorry. There are certain ones we don't ever want to eat. These over here on the left, these are jack-o'-lanterns, or called jacks for short. And they look similar to oyster mushrooms, but except for the color. There are definitely ways to tell them apart, but that's not a mistake you would want to make and think just because the shape, you know, and just assume, oh, it's an oyster, those are edible. You do not want to eat these. So it's very important to make sure that we, you know, that we're not eating anything that is not edible, that can cause big problems. And so there's a saying that I always share. There are two of them. The first one is just to remember, there are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. So you don't want to be bold. You don't want to take any chances in this area. Definitely want to, you know, be careful and be safe rather than sorry. But so when you see these pop up in your yard, a lot of times people are worried if they have kids or they have dogs, or, and I don't mean these as in these particular images on the screen. I just mean mushrooms in general. When they do pop up in our yard, if we aren't familiar with them and we don't know what they are, again, a lot of people get worried and they think, well, I don't want my dog to eat it. It might be poisonous or it might be toxic. Okay, you know, sure, that's fine. So this is where I've mentioned that the mushroom itself is like the fruit. So if we picture the whole, that whole fungal family that's happening above and below the soil, all of the different ones together and each individual one. If we think of those more as like trees or an orchard or a forest, the part that we see on top, the mushroom, that is like picking an apple off of a tree. So if you see mushrooms growing and you go and you think, well, they might be toxic, I don't want my dog to eat them, or whatever the case is, and you want to get rid of them, that's fine. But just know that when you pick those mushrooms off and discard them or compost them, whatever you do with them, that they may come back, because all you're doing is picking the fruit. You're not actually getting rid of it. It's all still there under the soil. And, you know, if it doesn't survive or live long, you know, it might not come back, but it probably will when the conditions are right, when the temperature is right, the season, you know, the moisture level, we've just had a good rain, they might pop back up again. So just know, because a lot of times people think when they pick them that they've gotten rid of them, but that's not always the case. So poisonous ones, that's definitely, you know, good to be careful about, but there are also edible ones. So we definitely want to make sure that we're only eating things that we know we can. So I've highlighted a few that are common in our area that you might see, that might pop up in our yards or in our gardens, that we could eat. And these are really good beginner mushrooms because they don't have lookalikes that would be poisonous or toxic that would harm us. So this one on the left is called chicken of the woods. There's also another one called hen of the woods. And so people confuse the names sometimes. Hen of the woods is maitake. That's different. That's a brown mushroom. That's different. This one, though, this is very distinct looking. It kind of looks like it's puffy. It's like foam. It's got those really distinct orange and yellow colors. And, you know, they're really eye-catching. And these, sometimes you'll see these growing kind of high up in trees. And if you look up on your walks, you might notice, or you might see this big bright color in the, you know, up higher. So I've seen people go to some pretty extreme lengths to try to climb a tree to get to a cluster of them that is out of reach and up a little bit high. But that's one that really doesn't have anything that looks just like that. So even though like the jack-o'-lanterns that I just showed also are orange, it's a completely different look. These look more dry, puffy, foamy. Those look more smooth, and you know, the edges are different, the shape is different. So just learning to recognize these is important, but there aren't really lookalikes like this that are easy to confuse with it that might harm you. So that's a good edible. If that pops up in your yard, you're very lucky, not just to have that good fungal life happening in your yard, but also to be able to get, you know, bonus, you get an edible mushroom. So the ones on the right that kind of look like pancakes, those are called pheasant's backs or dryad saddles. And if we look closely at the pattern on them, they do actually look like feathers, you know, like on a bird. So that's another one that is edible. They typically grow on dead or dying wood, especially elm. They like elm a lot. This is a dead elm tree in this picture. And this one, there are a few ways to identify it. One is by the smell. It smells like watermelon rind, which is very unique to this mushroom. So if you picture eating a watermelon slice and you've got that rind left over it, you'll know it when you smell it. You'll recognize it. So that's one way. It does smell like watermelon rind. And the key with eating these is that you want to get them when they're smaller. They start getting tough as they get big, and then they're not really as good to eat. So you want to get them when they're smaller. And again, no real lookalikes or anything. So it's a pretty good one, a pretty safe one to start with. And now, even the edible mushrooms, though, I do want to point out a couple of things in terms of safety. Aside from the old, you know, no old, bold mushroom hunters, there's also a saying that says all mushrooms are edible, but some are only edible once. So again, I have to go back to safety, because there are some that, you know, if you eat it, that will be the last thing you're eating. So again, safety first. But like I said, there aren't lookalikes for these. These are good. These are safe. Beyond the toxicity, though, even when you know you have a good, safe mushroom, if it's growing on something like treated lumber, you don't want to consume that. If it's growing on any area that may be contaminated, you do not want to eat those. Even if it's growing, you know, in perfect conditions, and you know what it is, and you know that it's edible, if you haven't had them before, I would not just start off by eating a ton of them. Just kind of ease your way into it. Try it first, instead of like, if you find, you know, a big, huge, you know, harvest of a particular mushroom, instead of, you know, cooking it all up because you're excited and eating it and having this big feast. If you've never had it before, start with a little bit, because occasionally, you know, just trying a new food, it might not agree with you. So just don't, you know, we don't want to go overboard. But so let's see, we've got the substrate. It's got to be clean. We want to make sure that it is definitely edible. We don't want to go crazy and eat too much. Oh, there was something else I was going to say on that, but you know what? It just disappeared. It'll come back to me. It usually does right when I'm not thinking about it. It'll pop back into my mind. So I'll get back to whatever that was. The other point I was going to make about that. Oh, I know what it was. See, it came right back. Cooking. We want to, even with our edible mushrooms that are safe to eat, they should be cooked. So a lot of times we'll see a salad with, you know, the fresh little button mushrooms on it. That's fine. But when you're growing mushrooms and you're harvesting mushrooms, just as a general rule, these should be cooked. We don't eat these raw. And in terms of, like I mentioned, with like a treated lumber or things like that, mushrooms are used for what's called mycoremediation. So cleaning up areas that are not clean, they do soak up all of these, toxins and things. So we definitely don't want to eat something that wasn't growing in a good, clean, safe to eat area. So that's something to keep in mind, that even if it's edible, we still have certain conditions. So we want to make sure. And that brings us to growing our own. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So this is another very easily recognizable mushroom that pops up a lot of times in our yards, right on the ground. This is a giant puffball mushroom. And this is a fall mushroom, autumn. So our mushrooms, they won't grow right now when there's all this snow on the ground and these very cold temperatures. And they don't want to grow in the heat of the summer, especially when it's hot and dry. There are a few that will, still fruit in the summer, but usually the seasons are spring and fall. Some are only in spring, that's their season, like the morel. Some are only in the fall. Some might be both. Oysters can be both, but it's the spring and the fall when the temperatures are right, when we've had rain and it's damp, we've got some humidity. Those are the conditions. So these giant puffballs we'll see a lot in the fall. And this picture on the right shows what it looks like on the inside when it's all chopped up. This is cubed. I was actually making a cream of mushroom soup. This is great for that. And these really soak up a lot of the flavor of whatever you cook them with. So this is a really popular one because it takes on those flavors of the seasonings or herbs that you add or whatever you cook it with. And you can cut slices of it and saute it or grill it or do all kinds of things. My parents actually made they had a bunch of big giant puffballs that they got from their property, and they breaded it and then fried it, and it looked like fried chicken. It was really interesting, and I don't eat meat, so it was really weird. It almost seemed like I was eating fried chicken. It was really good. They're very, very easy to cook with, and it's a very mild flavor. So very popular one, and very they're easy to ID and easy to find because they're just these big, white puff balls in the middle of your green grass or in the middle of the lawn or on the ground, and they just pop up out of nowhere. Some can be softball size, some can be like beach ball size. They get really huge. The thing is, when they start getting too big, then they don't, a lot of these actually have a shorter life, when they are ideal for eating. So this one on the left shows what it should look like, that white, clean, kind of puffy, spongy, marshmallowy looking texture. That's what we want. The one on the right that looks like old styrofoam, you do not want to eat. This one now is beyond its life. It is going bad. It's starting to brown. You do not want to eat it at that point. So this one I kind of already talked about when we were looking at the other slide. So I'm going to just kind of skip by this. But again, that's the pheasant's back or the dryad saddle and the chicken of the woods. Normally I use that other slide just as the intro, and then I get into more details on their own slide, but I kind of already talked about them when we were looking at the other picture. So we're going to skip it. So the prized morel. This one is one that I usually, when I say prized, people will look for them. When they find them, they want to keep that spot hidden. They don't share that information. They don't want people to know where they found them because they don't want to, have other people getting their harvests. And it's like a highly coveted and protected thing. If you're lucky enough to have these popping up in your yard, that's such a wonderful thing to have. They are a high dollar crop. These are sold for a lot of money. These are very expensive to purchase. And they have a really good flavor, which is part of the reason they're so highly prized. They have a short season. The time for these is May. And typically, you can actually watch, there are different morel groups that will post, it's like a picture of a map of Illinois, and it will show from Southern Illinois when people are starting to spot them, they put a little mushroom on the map, and then you'll see those mushrooms start moving further and further north. And when it's getting to our area, then to go start looking because it's time for the season. But it's a short window of harvest. Not only do we like them, but the deer and squirrels and other animals like to eat a lot of these mushrooms as well. And so a lot of times too, you might find some, but you're only seeing the bottom because the tops have been bitten off. The deer have snapped as they walked through. They got there first because they live there, and see them every day and see them right when they first pop up. So these are easy to identify, but not this is one though, I have a caveat with this one. The others, there really aren't any lookalikes. So those are like the top of the easiest mushrooms to find in our yard that could be edible or to try to grow in our yards. These though, with the morels, there are some types of false morels that we don't want to eat. So learning your ID is very, very important. And so the first thing to check if you think you've found a morel, and these are, so there are yellow morels, black morels, there are different types and colors that, you know, there are a few that are edible. When you think you found one, what you'll want to do if you're unsure is to cut it in half lengthwise from top to bottom, and it will be hollow on the inside, completely hollow. Also, that cap is attached. It's not like some where the cap is on top and it's separate, it's detached from that stem. They're completely one shape, it's attached and it's hollow on the inside. If it's not hollow and the cap is not totally attached in that way, you do not want to eat it. And you can even see on some of these, like right here in the center, this is hollow. Even though these aren't cut, you can kind of see right here, this is hollow inside. So that tells you that you have an actual morel and not a false morel. And so the reason this is a picture of my dog, Dixie, on the right. She's on here because if you look very closely right down here in front of her, we were near some oak trees. Morels like to grow near oaks, apple trees. Sometimes people find them in old orchards. We were near some oak trees and my dog actually found this one. So just like in Italy and other places, they have dogs that will hunt truffles. Here my dog found a morel. She actually found a morel before I did. So she got to get her picture taken with it rather than me. But these are great. And now this has been something that people have been trying to grow at home or grow commercially for a long time, and they've had trouble. Similar to like with truffles, there's a symbiosis with the trees that they grow with and the roots, and kind of like that mycorrhizal, that relationship that we were talking about a minute ago. Truffles have a similar situation. So they have very particular growing demands, kind of, you know, a growing situation that they need. Morels are kind of the same way, maybe not to that extent, but there has been some progress, and there are people actually now who are starting to sell kits to be able to grow morels at home. So that's really interesting and something to look into and to watch for if that's something you're interested in. People are actually starting to have some success, which is kind of cool. So oyster mushrooms. These are ones that we'll find in the wild and that you can also easily purchase to grow on your own. So there are several reasons for wanting to grow our own. First of all, just to know what variety it is, to be sure of your ID. If we're ever unsure when we're foraging, this is a way to do the whole process where you have some control. You've got it right there where you can watch it. You can learn more about the process and really be able to, you know, for sure what you're getting. You know what you're inoculating and you know what to look for, you know when to look. And then you can be more comfortable with harvesting and eating something that you have grown yourself. Then you're not questioning the ID. You also know when it's ready. So I mentioned a lot of these times, a lot of these different mushrooms, there's a very short window for when they're ready to eat. Also, you can still have wildlife trying to get to them before you do, even growing them in your yard. You know, if you've got hungry squirrels that want to eat them, or deer in your yard. But instead of being out in the woods somewhere, if they're right there in your yard, you can see that better and you'll know when they're ready, you know when they're fruiting, so that you can hopefully harvest them. Rather than like with the morels I mentioned, we may know the season, but you have to go out and go look for them and hope that you're going to find them. In this case, they're right there, you know when to expect them, you can kind of keep an eye, and when they do start fruiting, you're there and you're ready for it, instead of trying to get the timing just right where you happen to be out and happen to find them at that right time. And the other thing too is, in terms of being out and trying to forage them somewhere, it's not legal to forage in a lot of places. So this is another way to make sure you're getting a harvest and that it's legal. You can grow your own in your yard, but you can't always, even if you do find them somewhere, you can't always harvest them and take them home. We don't want to be taking them from our forest preserves or anything like that. So growing our own is a really good way to make sure that we're getting those harvests. oyster mushrooms are one of my favorite to start with. These are a really good beginner mushroom to grow on your own. There are a lot of different varieties, but they're a great beginner mushroom. So these on the left, they're gray doves, they're different blue types of varieties. The one on the right, I think this one is probably a pohu, but it's P-O-H-U, that's a variety. There are a lot of different kinds. And I have found these in the woods. I found them to be able to forage them. I've also grown them. Again, like I said, one of the best beginner mushrooms. So I highly recommend if you want to try to grow your own. Oysters are a great one to start with. Oysters and shiitakes, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So there is one type. We do have a golden oyster, though, that has escaped cultivation. We've got people who are trying to grow, they might have their mushroom logs outside. That one spreads so readily that it's showing up in a lot of different woods and forest systems just on its own, kind of like, we have escaped cultivars from people's gardens that will show up in the woods. That's happening with the mushrooms, where they did, grow in the wild, but not to the extent that they are right now. So you may find golden oysters. Typically this one on the left, this isn't one that we would typically see around here, just walking in the woods. But this one on the right does look very similar to what you might find. We tend to have this more like tan, creamy color, and I have found those in the woods pretty readily. So whether you're foraging, growing your own, oysters are a great mushroom. Now, this one on the left doesn't look like a whole lot of other mushrooms. This one on the right, though, could be confused with some things. So even with the same type of mushroom, there are different varieties that can make ID sometimes a little tricky. So we always want to be sure, again, that we have the right thing, which is why growing our own, is really good. So in terms of mushroom identification, there are certain things that are really important to know. Even if you're out walking, like I said, I like to take pictures and then get them ID'd later if I find something that I don't know or that I wasn't familiar with. If you are even going to ask someone who's an expert, they're going to ask you for certain things. They want certain information to be able to help you with that ID. So some of the things they're looking for are substrate. What is it growing on? Was it growing on a tree? Was it a living tree? Was it a dead tree? Do you know what type of tree? Was it growing on the ground, like those puffballs? Was it growing, in this case, you have to be a little careful sometimes. So this on the left is a pheasant back. And as you saw in the other photos, they usually are growing on dead wood, especially elm trees. But in this case, this is growing on the ground. So that's odd. But if we investigate a little further, because I know to look for this, because I know that that should be on an elm tree, I looked, and if I went a little deeper into that tall grass and moved it around, there was actually a piece of wood that was kind of pushed down and pressed into the soil. It was kind of buried, and with the grass growing on it, it looked like this was growing on grass. It wasn't. It was still growing on dead wood. It just happened to be covered. So we have to know for sure what it's growing on. That helps a lot in ID, because certain mushrooms only grow on certain things. So that really helps us to narrow it down. Then we look at the spores. This on the right is what's called a spore print. And that's done by taking the top, like the cap of the mushroom, or in this case, the whole mushroom, because it's not just a cap with a stem. Since it's a different type, it's more of a shelf mushroom there. We put it on a white piece of paper and you leave it. And then when you lift it, it will leave, it's dropping spores. And that tells us a lot by the shape, by the type of gills. So we can see here that rather than starting at the center and all of these gills going all the way to the end, we can see that they're kind of branching off. Like it gets to here, and then it's got kind of some splits in it. So that is helpful to know when we're IDing. The color of the spores can be helpful. So there's all kinds of information that can be gathered also from a spore print. The gills themselves, like I mentioned, that would be, whether they're straight, whether they're connected, whether they split, do they go all the way to the edge or not? Or do they even have gills? Because like this one on the right, here's that pheasant back again, it has pores. This is a polypore. It doesn't have gills. So we need to know that. And then the stems of the mushroom too. Here, the color of the gills is another topic. The stem, is it attached or detached? Like I mentioned with the Morels, is there a ring on it, like a cuff or a collar? All of those things are important. So just those are good things to have in mind for your own practice in working on, learning to ID these things when they pop up in our yards or when you see them on your walks. But also if you want to have someone help you ID it with, ID a certain thing that you found, this is the information that they're going to need to know to help you make a proper ID. So that's all really important. Also, there are other things like color changing. So not just the color of the mushroom or the color of the gills or the color of the spores, but there are mushrooms where when we break them, they change color when they're exposed to the oxygen. So they might turn a purple or a blue color. And that is another thing that will help us with ID. And then the time of year, like I mentioned, there are certain things and where we are. So, if you're talking to someone else around here, that's great. But if you're talking to someone somewhere else, they need to know where you found this mushroom growing, not just the substrate, but what location on the earth, where are we? Because different mushrooms will grow in different places, different seasons, etc. So all very important to know. Now, when we're growing our own, there are a lot of good ways to get started. And so we have kind of different levels, I guess, of, depending on how much you want to tackle. So usually the very first thing, and maybe some of you have tried this, a lot of times in garden centers, we see a little cardboard box, like a kit that comes ready to go. All you have to do is soak it in water, you take it out, and then you'll get a little flush of mushrooms. And those are usually oyster mushrooms in those kits. Very easy, entry-level, beginner, super fun, and if that's all you ever do, great. It's still fun and you get to harvest your own countertop mushrooms. Typically, though, you don't get more than one harvest out of those. It's just, it's just to try it out. But that's a really good place to start. Then if you enjoyed that and you want to do more, you have options. So in this case right here, oyster mushrooms can be grown on a lot of different types of substrates. So we've got some straw or some hay here, grasses that are dried, even wood chips, sawdust, coffee grounds, toilet paper and paper towel rolls, all kinds of things like that, as long as it's that carbon-based organic matter and it's clean and good. There are all kinds of different substrates that you can grow oyster mushrooms on. So that's their food. And then we also have to provide the right conditions. So you can see in this picture in the back, this is kind of if any of you have ever used those greenhouses with the plastic covers, that's what this is. And it's creating like a humidity chamber. So we want humidity. They need some moisture. One thing that's really interesting, especially when we're growing mushrooms on logs, which I'll get to in a minute, where the mycelium is populating that log, they actually, as part of their growing process, they produce a little bit of their own moisture, a little bit of their own water as part of their, if we think about like plants and respiration and things like that, mushrooms have in their life pattern, in their growth habits, they are producing a little bit of that on their own. However, not enough. We need to make sure that their conditions are right, that we don't ever want them to dry out completely, which can be difficult, like in these dry winters, if you're growing indoors and we've got heat going and all of this. So we need to make sure that they have enough moisture and a little bit of humidity, and they like darker areas. So if we think of the forest floor, they're under the shade of all the other plants and our shrub layers and our understory and overstory trees, they're not getting as much light, and they like the damp, kind of darker, humid areas. So we can create that indoors so that we can have the right growing conditions to be able to grow this. Now, if you want to grow something on any type of substrate like this indoors, you would be buying you're basically buying spores to inoculate that. So it's also called spawn. You'll be buying that and getting it mixed in, giving it the proper conditions. When you order, most places will give you really good, clear instructions on exactly what to do and how to care for the particular mushroom you're trying to grow. I like, and right now it's seed, I heard you guys are talking about seed starting soon, and it's seed catalog season, right? So I'm even like, my whole desk is covered in seed catalogs over here. But in addition to my seed catalogs, I have a mushroom catalog. So this is Field and Forest Products. I'll put that so you guys can see that a little better. They are out of Wisconsin, so they're regional, they're semi-local-ish, and I really like a lot of their offerings and their information. You know, they are helpful. Even in the catalog, there's a lot of good information in here about the types of wood that different mushrooms like to grow on, and what type of wood, what season is it best to source your wood. And they have a lot of information, so they're really good. Another one that's in Northern Illinois is called Myco Ethos, and that's another really good one that's a little more local as well. Small business, I like to support our small business, and knowledgeable and very helpful. So those are a couple of options if you are looking to order something to try to grow on your own. So you can look through the catalog, they have websites, you can look online and see all the different types and varieties that they have and what to grow them on. But just so that you know what you're looking at, there are different ways that you can order it. So you can order it to inoculate your own substrate, like here in this picture, in these pictures. And here's another, this one on the left, there are holes drilled in the bottom of this. So they're forcing it to fruit out of the holes for easy harvest, which is pretty cool. And then they can keep the moisture inside. Their substrate is inside, but it's fruiting toward the outside, which is pretty cool. Those are oysters. Again, look at how huge some of these are. These are really big. We don't want them to get too big because they'll go beyond the point of a good harvest and good eating, you know. But anyway, so that's another fun one. But on the right here, now this was a class I was teaching where we were inoculating logs, mushroom logs. We were growing shiitakes. So this was last spring. I think we did shiitakes in the spring, and then we did oysters in the fall. I did 2 separate classes. So that's another way that you can order. And I'm going to show you in just a minute a log and how you inoculate a mushroom log. I'm just going to give you like a kind of a preview to show you what it is that you'd be buying, but they're called plug spawn. So they come, it's like a little peg that you'll drill holes. And that's what this is my friend Ellen. And this was in class, we drilled the holes already. And so we tapped in the little plug spawn into the log. And then right here, what she's doing in this picture is sealing it with wax. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but this is another option. So when you see in your catalogs or you want to order to do a mushroom log, that's one option that you'll see are called plug spawn. And they're little pieces of wood, little pegs that are already inoculated full of those mushroom spores that we need. And we're putting them into the wood to populate that log and let them grow so that log is the food source. That's what the mushroom is going to grow on because that's what it's eating. It's breaking down that wood. So we have to choose the right wood. We want to grow for the mushroom we want to grow. We need to give it the right type of food. And there's a lot more information in the catalog on that and what type of wood you want. So, oops, what just happened there? Oh, just went right back to the beginning. Oh, good. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing so that I can show you. Let me see. Okay. Are we good? Stop sharing. You guys can see me now and not my slides.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So I just want to make sure so you can see this. When we are growing mushrooms on a log, the way we want to do it, first of all, a lot of times people think we need a decaying log or an old log or a wet, soft log. That's actually what we don't want, because once by the time the log has gotten to that point, it's probably already populated with competing strains of mushrooms that just happen to populate it on their own. I just saw this. I'll do questions after, but just because I just saw that one pop up. This is Field and Forest Products was the name of that catalog. Field and Forest Products out of Wisconsin. And I can make sure that you guys have that too, but I'll leave that up there for a second. So the logs that we're choosing, we actually want fresh wood. this is like fresh food. We wouldn't want to eat an old rotten lettuce salad. We want the fresh lettuce, right? So it's kind of the same thing. Our mushrooms that are growing, we want to give them fresh food to eat. If we are getting wood that is too, it's been dead for a long time, it's already probably got something else growing in it that's going to compete with what you're trying to grow. So the best wood that we want is within 6 months of being cut, and we want to be cutting from living trees. So, we don't want to just go cutting down all of our trees so we can grow mushrooms, but a prime opportunity for mushroom growing, first of all, if you do have things maybe that are growing too crowded and we can do some selective cutting, that can be good. But also in the springtime when we have storms come through and big branches come down, and trees fall or they break or they, get struck by lightning or things like that happen, that's a great time to source some logs for mushrooms. And if it happens in your own yard, depending on the type of tree, you can look up and say, oh, I have this, mulberry that came down or a hackberry or something that came down in the storm. And, what kind of mushroom can I grow on this? And then you can find that. So we want wood that's within 6 months old. It has to be fresh. And we want healthy living trees, like I mentioned. So when we have that, then we talk about size. We want approximately a 4-inch diameter log, 4 to 6 inches. We don't want it to be too big. So 4 to 6 inches is good. And you can grow these in different lengths. So depending on your setup and your space, generally a 3-foot log is good, somewhere around that area. This is a little smaller. I don't know if you can see both sides. It's not really big. I'll move back a little maybe so you can see the whole size. A lot of mushrooms, especially our oysters and shiitakes, some of our good beginner mushrooms, like to grow on oak and maple, and also hackberry and black cherry, and I mentioned elm with different types. So again, the type of mushroom you're growing determines what type of wood you should use, and vice versa. If you have a particular type of wood, you want to choose a mushroom that wants that type of wood. So then what we do is we drill a hole. There's the specific size. I was going to say 3/8, but that sounds too big. I have to refresh my memory on that. I have a special drill bit for this. You can use drill bits with a stopper, or there are certain types that are just the right, give you exactly the right depth and the right width for your plugs. We drill our holes generally about 6 inches apart, going down the whole log, and then we stagger. So in this row, I would have them here, going down. Then in my next row, they're opposite. So we do here and then here and then here and then here. So they're opposite, going all the way around on the whole log. Then this is what the plug spawn looks like. If I can get this to focus a little bit here for you. So I'll hold that up for you too, so you can get a better look. So this is what it looks like. It's a little wooden peg, and it has little ridges in it, and the ridges hold the mushroom spores, the spawn. And you can see on this end, this has already got a little mycelium starting to grow on it. So basically all of this, the mushroom spores that are on here, we're taking this and then we use a rubber mallet. We don't want to split this wood or damage it or splinter it. So we use a rubber mallet, and you just gently tap these little pegs into each hole on the log. And then once you've done that and you've filled the whole thing, on a log, typical log size, you can fit about 50, depending on the size of your log, around 50 or so little plug spawn on there. Then we have, this is, again, see if I can get this to focus. There we go, plug wax. So you'll want wax because we need to seal everywhere that we've put one of those little pegs in. We want to seal it up so nothing else gets in. We want what we're inoculating the log with to be all that's in there. So we seal it up to make sure nothing else gets in. There are different types of wax that you can use, and some of them you need to melt and then dab on. I just think those are a lot messier, but it's personal preference. I like this kind. It's cheese wax and mineral oil is what this is made of. And this is very, very sticky, but I'm going to take it out so you can see it's kind of like just a chunk of wax, and it's pretty soft. So you can, get little pieces off, and then you just, they're very sticky. Then you just kind of spread it around each one of those little plugs to make sure it's sealed nicely. And we want to make sure we keep our logs wet. We don't need them soaked. We don't want them, floating necessarily in water, but we want to keep them in an area that's going to be those good conditions where it's a little damp, a little shady, a little dark and a little cool, not in direct sun that's going to heat it up too hot or dry it out too quickly. And where, maybe if you're watering your garden, you can also water your logs when they need it. We don't ever want them to dry out completely. So when you do that and you've inoculated your log and you make sure that you keep it in those good conditions, you will see mushrooms, depending on when you start the log, generally between 4 to 12 months after inoculating that log. So it needs time for that mycelium to spread and completely, fully populate the log before it will be ready to fruit. Once it's populated that whole log, it also needs to have the right conditions. So again, we have to wait for spring or fall, the right temperatures and the rainfall, and then you'll get a fruit, you're fruiting. So that's why it's 4 to 12 months, because it depends on when you started it. It's not going to fruit in the winter, even though it's been 4 months. It depends on when you started it. You have to wait for the right season. So anywhere from 4 to 12 months before you get your first flush. Then after that, you can let them naturally keep producing, and you'll probably get mushrooms in the spring and in the fall each year. These mushroom logs can last anywhere from 2 to 10 years and still provide you mushrooms. Now, by that 10th year, you're not going to be getting as many, but people have been surprised and thought, I figured 5, 6 years, and several years later, they're still every once in a while popping up a handful of more mushrooms. So they're really nice. And even though you have to wait initially, it's kind of like a fruit tree, you have to wait for that initial harvest. But once you get that first one, you'll keep getting harvests then for quite a long time. So it's very, very rewarding. So I mentioned the two that I would start with would be oysters and shiitakes. So the last one I want to mention is really easy to inoculate and to grow. This one would be the wine cap. And those you can just inoculate your mulch in your yard, as long as you're not using like a chemically treated or a dyed colored, some type of store-bought mulch. But if you just use natural wood chips, you can just inoculate the wood chips in your garden and get wine cap mushrooms. It's one of the easiest to put out there to get ready, easy maintenance, and really good, delicious mushrooms. And they're beautiful too. They're called wine caps because they have these really pretty dark burgundy red tops. And then the stems are very pretty and they're tasty and good for cooking. So you've got a few different options then when you're ready to start growing them on your own. And then last point I'm going to make on that, and then we can go to questions. When you are growing your own, there are certain types that respond well to forcing. So the same way we can force forsythia blooms or different things to get them to flower, we can force certain mushrooms. So typically shiitakes respond really well to forcing. Oysters, not as much. You might have some success, but they're not as good for that as shiitakes. But basically what that means is once you've had your flush, you've had your harvest, and now it's going back into that more dormant phase, you can, to try to force it to fruit again, you can soak the log in water. You don't want to do it for too long, 12 hours, like do it overnight, up to close to 24, but no more than that. We don't want too much. But by soaking it and giving it that big boost of moisture, it will stimulate them to fruit again. So the more often you do that, that's now your log might not be fruiting in 10 years because you're getting more harvests up front. You're kind of forcing it to come through. Once that remember that the mushrooms, all that fungal life that's in that log is eating it and breaking it down. So the more we are making it grow faster, the quicker it may be getting through its food source. So it might not last as long, but you're getting more upfront. So something to consider when you're actually like really trying to time a harvest or get an extra harvest or things like that. There are certain ones that respond well to that, and that's always kind of fun too, to have a little bit more control instead of just waiting for kind of watching. But that's fun too. It's like a surprise to keep checking on it. You're like, oh, it's that season. Maybe I'll get some mushrooms. And we actually had really good luck with the shiitakes that we did last spring. That was May that we inoculated those logs in that class. And I was getting emails from all of the students in September that we're getting mushrooms, they're growing, we're getting a harvest. So that was actually pretty quick. So that was really nice. And it's so rewarding when you get that first flush and that first harvest. It's fun when that pops up. So yeah, let's go ahead and do questions, because I threw a whole lot at you in the last hour. So I'm sure you've got a lot. So let's see what we can answer for you. Hopefully I can answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Beautiful. Oh my gosh, your pictures were absolutely gorgeous. Many people said that in the chat too.
Thank you.
So appreciate that. So the first question we have, are mushrooms related to lichens?
So that's a very good question. Lichens are actually their own unique thing that they grow from your mushrooms and algae. So it's kind of got both. We've got plants and fungi working together there. So lichens are different, but related in some ways, if that answers it all. And lichen is a whole nother fascinating topic. Lichen are very cool.
Thank you. And then we have, it was actually answered already. Are there dangerous puffball lookalikes? And the answer I think you said was no.
Not for the giant puffballs. There are other types of puffballs, little small ones, brown ones. So there aren't really like those giant puffballs, those big white ones. There's nothing else that really looks like that would be harmful.
Okay, thank you. And then another question, are all mushrooms compostable, even the poisonous ones?
Yeah, so if you are making sure that you are applying finished compost, then you have nothing to worry about, because that fruiting body will be completely broken down. It's not going to be leaving toxins or anything in there. You can toss it in there. Just to be on the safe side though, when we're talking about our composting systems, we need a really hot compost. Even the hottest composting system isn't hot enough to sterilize all seeds and pathogens and things like that. So if you had something really like a death angel mushroom that like is completely deadly, I wouldn't toss it in anything that I'm maybe going to be applying on food, just because I wouldn't take the chance. But most of your backyard mushrooms that you find, if you toss them in the compost, as long as you're finishing your compost before you apply it to anything, then it's fine.
Okay, thank you.
One more on that, actually. When we are picking mushrooms, there's something to consider. I mentioned the spore print and the spores that will come out of those caps and the pores or the gills or whatever type of mushroom it is. If you are harvesting something like a morel or your oysters or shiitakes, and you want those spores to hit the ground and maybe grow and take off and produce more, then it's good to harvest into a mesh bag that those spores can fall through and land on the ground again. If you're harvesting something that you really don't want spreading in your yard, maybe something that is toxic or just that you don't want, then put it into a bag that is sealed. You don't want to be dropping the spores around so that it will be reproducing. So that's just another thought on that.
Okay, thank you. Another question was regarding the golden oyster. Is the escaped golden oyster causing any problems in the area where it has escaped to?
That's an excellent question. Not that I know of yet, but there are concerns that it may, because of the speed at which it is multiplying and showing up in places and spreading. So I don't think it's causing any issues currently, but there are concerns that it might.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And then, we talked about the catalog. So then the next one is, how long do you get wine cap harvests once you inoculate your wood chips?
Yeah, That is a shorter season than logs. I want to say 3 years, 3 to 4, depends. Our wood chips also depends on the type of wood, the size of the chips, and how fast it goes through that. But they're so easy that even if you're only getting harvests, for 1, 2, 3 years, it's honestly not expensive and it's so easy. You can just inoculate again. It's much less work than doing a log, for example. You just sprinkle some stuff on the ground and you're good. It's pretty easy.
Thank you. Does the harvest grow through the plugs?
No, that's actually a good question. It grows around it and it will actually come out of the wood because it is breaking down the wood. So it's going to come out of those little holes. So everywhere that we put a plug, it's growing off of the plug and it will work its way out of the log and out of that hole, out of that space. But it's also then, eating away at some of the wood as well.
And this question just came in and it is relating to the wine caps. What do they taste like?
Ooh, good question. So a lot of times with mushrooms, it's a little bit more of a matter of texture than flavor because a lot of them have kind of a mild flavor. Puffball is very mild, has hardly any flavor. So some, they do have varying degrees. Something like a truffle has a very strong flavor. But most of them are mild. So, it's like, well, it tastes like a mushroom. Well, that's not a good explanation. But you know what I mean, though, there's that little bit of the mushroom flavor that has variations, but they're all kind of similar and have that mild flavor. But the texture is different. So like where the puffball is more spongy and then the oyster is more smooth or slippery, a wine cap is a little more meaty. So it's a little more similar to, actually, I would say shiitakes are the same way, a little bit more meaty. And I'm trying to think of what else would be like that. Not even necessarily portobellos, but sometimes even the button mushrooms that we get, the bigger ones can be a little more meaty, but when we cook them, they get soft. And the wine caps, though, I would say are more on the meaty side rather than the smoother, slippery, or spongy, if that makes sense, texture-wise. But they're pretty mild also. They don't have a really strong flavor, so they're not going to be anything that would be objectionable. Like some people like truffles and some don't because it's a much stronger flavor. Wine caps are pretty mild.
Thank you. Okay, here's another question. If you grow mushrooms outdoors, do you worry about hitchhiker mushrooms growing in the materials you inoculate?
Yeah, great question. So that goes back to making sure we're inoculating fresh wood. If we are putting in the spores we want to grow and giving them the right conditions and allowing that to spread, they will populate that log. And even if there are some competitors, they shouldn't really affect anything. And sometimes too, actually going back to the lichens, sometimes we'll see some things on the surface or on the bark that won't affect our mushrooms at all. But if we're using older wood, then we're taking a chance that it could already be populated with something else and there could be some competition, and that can reduce our harvests or prevent them completely. So it's really good to know that the log you're using is fresh and healthy.
Thank you. And are there certain mushrooms that are better to avoid as a beginner?
In terms of growing them or in terms of harvesting, like foraging them? In terms of foraging, yes, as a beginner, beware of all of them just to be safe, and there are those certain ones that are much easier to identify and you should be good with those. But otherwise, always, I would be cautious. In terms of growing, there are certain mushrooms that are a little bit more advanced. They might, just like plants, if we have house plants, garden plants outside, they have different needs, and we have to, some are a little more particular than others. They need a little more babying or coddling. So there are certain ones that would be more difficult. But even like I mentioned, lion's mane, which is really good for our memory, that might be a little bit more intermediate to advanced mushroom. And I don't know that there are any that I would say totally avoid. I'm one of those like, hey, if you want to grow it, try it. Even if it doesn't work, that's up to you, but it's a learning experience. And the next time you'll do something differently and it'll work out better. So I wouldn't say don't grow any of them or avoid any. There aren't any that are that hard, but there are some that are easier.
Okay, thank you. And then what is your favorite tasting mushroom that you have grown?
You know, I thought that it would have been the oysters, honestly, but I really, really like the shiitakes. I really like those. Those are really good. It's got a little bit more of a nutty flavor, and I don't eat meat, so it's got that substance that makes it a little more. You can season those too and marinate them, and they take on a little bit of the flavors, kind of like how I said with the puffball. You can saute and add your herbs, and they soak up a lot of the flavors. The shiitakes do well with marinades, and so kind of like if anybody ever eats like a portobello burger, those types of things, it cooks well. So those are kind of nice. It was kind of a nice, pleasant surprise. And I think the next one I want to try are chestnut mushrooms. I have not grown those yet, but I think that might be one of the next ones I try. So yeah, I'm interested to try those. But I do like the wine caps also. Those are also good.
Thanks. And that is all the questions we have in the chat right now. Does anybody else have a question off the top of their head that they might want to ask?
Oh, I have not tried growing portobellos. No, no. So another name I'll mention, I mentioned that documentary, Fantastic Fungi, and so Paul Stamets is featured in that. If you have not heard of Paul Stamets, he is an expert. He is like a world-renowned mycologist. And he said at one point that if you are going to eat portobellos, you have to cook them at a very high heat. We commonly eat them. It's not anything that's, making us sick or anything like that. And I don't know exactly everything behind it or why he said that, but I remember him saying that you have to cook it at a very high heat to make it, really good and good for us. Not just, he wasn't talking about, culinary wise, like the taste or anything, but for health reasons. He said it's best to cook those at a really high heat. So because of that, I was kind of like, I'm not really sure why that is, but I've been a little more, I haven't really gotten into those as much, especially when there are so many options and there are so many just easy ones to get going that, you can kind of constantly get different harvests. I haven't tried anything with portobellos. No, I would love to try, I don't know, truffles won't really do well around here. We don't have the right climate, but I'd love to try to grow my own morels at some point instead of just finding them. That's my dad now finds all the ones I taught my parents, about how to find them, and now they get them all before I do. So I I need to grow my own now.
And we do have another question. Can mushrooms be grown in a greenhouse, or what is the best temperature range?
Okay, so the only thing with the greenhouse is you would probably want to provide some shade. So you might need a shade cloth or some kind of cover. You don't want it to be too bright, for one thing. You also don't want it to be too hot. So it depends on the season. You could do them in a greenhouse in certain months. But if it's something that if it's a quick growing type of a thing, like those little countertop ones, sure. But if it's something that needs a long season, unless it's a heated greenhouse, it'll be too cold in the winter to get a harvest. You'll still get a harvest in the spring, but it's not warm enough to keep it going in the winter. And in the summer, it's going to be too hot and they're going to go dormant. So it's kind of like, then they could just be outside at that point. In terms of the temperature range, most mushrooms don't fruit over 80 degrees. Even 80 degrees is the high end of the range, which is why the spring and the fall are the ideal times for finding them outside or for growing them outside. That's when you'll get fruiting. It's typically between 50 to 70 degrees-ish, give or take a little plus or minus, but in that range. There are certain varieties that will fruit up to about 80 degrees or so, but most like it a little cooler, not too cold, not too hot. They like that kind of in-between temperature, that 50 to 70 range.
Hey, Connie, in Pennsylvania, they grow them in abandoned coal mines, just right temperature, right darkness and everything, and have great success. I did want to say something about people, if they have a fairy ring and want to get rid of it, either dig out the wood. If it's tree roots, you can't. Use some dry Tide soap and sprinkle it on them, and that will kill the fairy ring. And as far as when you talk about ecto and endo mycorrhiza fungi, if you looked at the roots of my onions, the roots will be, foot and a half long, because the fungi brings up the nutrients to the roots of the onion. And man, I can grow onions like you can't believe from that. So that's a good point for the people that are gardeners.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love to see that too. And sometimes too, if you have wood chips, like a big pile of them, and you know, you'll go to put a shovel in to get it, and you'll see all the white threads. You'll see the mycelium already growing in there. That's again why I go back to, you know, people see that and they think, oh my gosh, like I'm growing mold. This is awful. It's not. It's the mycelium. That's great. That's fantastic. It's doing its work. So that's good when you see that. But that's really cool about your onions. I would like to see that even. That's really cool.
Well, thank you so much. And if people want to put their videos on or unmute, and let's give Connie a big hand.